Hello, networkers, and welcome back to another episode of Ask the Network Engineer, where I will answer one of your questions. And this question comes from Brian Thomas, and he asked, what are some questions that I should be asking myself when choosing the right hardware for my client? Let's talk about that. So here is a very simple checklist that I've been using for many years. And the same checklist is found in the Network Design Cookbook. This is a book that I published many years ago, and you can get more details here. So let me go ahead and talk about some of these particular type of questions that I usually ask or gather for new hardware or for software that I'm looking at for a company or for a client. The first thing that I like to know is basically vendor stability. Have they been around for a while? Now, this is basically what I talked about in one of the episodes where I gave you my experiences with Cisco, about me working at Cisco, and about Cisco kind of losing focus and that presentation. So check that out to get more details. But what I talked about in that video episode was about vendor maturity, that you want to choose a vendor and a product that has been around for a long time. Because if you're choosing a vendor that is very brand new and they don't have a lot of funding, so they're basically a startup company, there's good chances that that product may cease to exist. So choose products that have been around for a long time and a company that has been around for a long time. That's a very big deal from a support perspective. Another question that I ask is user connection limitations, like how many connections or sessions through a particular firewall or router. I like to know those details because I can determine from the business like how many connections are we expecting, concurrent connections are we expecting, and you want to try to align that information appropriately. Another question that I ask is about licensing. This is a big one for me because this seems to be a very hidden thing that you don't really, that you're not able to gather on data sheets and things like that. So like with firewalls, right, there is licensing that's required. Well, I like to know what things can I license? What features needs to be licensed? What are the costs for that? I like to know all those details because that could mean buying this particular router or firewall or switch. Plus, there is the licensing required to operate certain features. So knowing what the licensing model is very important. Another question that I ask is in regards to the performance, the throughput, bandwidth, traffic per second, those details about the hardware that I'm looking into. And that's important because maybe you have a client that's going to get a 100 meg connection for the internet, or maybe it's a 1 gig connection. So that has happened a couple of times for me. Therefore, you want to make sure that you get a hardware appliance that can support potentially up to that particular bandwidth rate. I ask questions or I gather questions about the configuration and the management of that product. And that's important because it depends on who is managing that device on a day-to-day basis. So is the configuration all CLI? Or maybe there is a web interface for doing configurations. In most cases, there will be a web interface involved. There'll be a CLI on the back end that you can definitely do more detailed and advanced configuration or troubleshooting. But you may want to figure out those details. Because if the person who's managing the network has very limited networking experience, then you want to make sure that the interface for managing this device is not too hard. Another question that I ask is in regards to maintenance. How does maintenance work on that device? In terms of installing patches, software upgrades, doing emergencies, what kind of downtime typically happens or occurs? You want to figure out those details as well. Another thing that I like to determine is the compatibility or the flexibility of that product. So for example, if I'm looking at a Cisco switch and I know that switch will connect to a Juniper switch, then it's important to know, can they play nice together? What's the compatibility between them that I need to keep in mind? Or other type of flexibility for what that product can support, like connecting with other solutions for voice or with maybe LDAP or Active Directory. It's good to understand the compatibility that it can or cannot support. Another thing that I like to look for, and this is probably the very first thing that you will be doing, and that is getting information such as data sheets and white papers. And the data sheets, if you know, is going to provide a lot of this information from this checklist automatically. It's going to provide details of the different hardware models that exist and modules, some of the performance metrics, user limitations or connection counts, things like the features supported and the maintenance. All these details, most of that will be present in the data sheets. So it's good to kind of get the data sheets, read through it, and determine everything that you can about that product. Another thing that is probably the most important of them all is the cost. How much is this hardware or software package or solution going to cost? Including any kind of recurring costs or initial costs, things like that. You want to figure that out because that makes a difference. Because I remember doing a particular quote that I gathered the requirements using this checklist to figure out the best hardware for a client. And I remember it came down to a FortiGate and a Palo Alto Networks firewall. They saw the price of the Palo Alto Network firewall and they almost laughed. They're very expensive firewalls, and they went with the actual FortiGates. So those things are important to figure out what is the cost of these appliances and basically presenting that to the client. Another thing that's important to know is the support model and basically who is going to be supporting this particular device, okay? And I kind of mentioned this kind of before regarding to configuration for maintenance. So this is kind of a redundant thing, but the support model is important, okay? So if I'm going to basically configure and deploy a Catalyst switch or a Nexus switch for a company, well, who's managing that? So that support model is important in terms of the labor, the people who will be dealing with that. And that also includes things such as like the parts. How much does parts cost typically for this device? Like for power supplies, for fan trays, for fabric modules, for line modules, supervisory engine, and everything else. It's important to understand what kind of parts we may need to keep in mind and to have available if there is an issue. Okay. Now we will probably have or recommend RMA support. So those are things we can figure out as well. And it's kind of part of the maintenance in some sense. Like, is it hot swappable? You want to ask those kind of questions. I also like to understand or to gather case studies and ask for case study information about what companies are using this product and how are they using it. Because we could want to call them up and have a conversation with them and ask, how is this working out for your environment? What kind of challenges is it resolving? So for larger projects that's very expensive for the company, we like to ask those questions and to really know how other companies are using those products. Another thing that I like to do for me personally is, where is this product positioned as a solution? Like if I'm looking at a firewall, then I know that this is typically probably for an internet edge solution that's connected towards the edge to provide protection from an untrusted network. Or maybe it's for a wireless type network or for a data center or for a LAN campus. I like to ask those questions to figure out the positioning of that product. I also like to understand about consultation or professional services. What companies exist that supports this product in terms of providing professional or consulting services, like let's say Cisco. So I'm a Cisco consultant. I don't work for Cisco anymore, but I have my own company and I specialize with Cisco consulting, or primarily as Cisco, okay? So I like to kind of keep in mind, like if I'm choosing a product like Concentury, then what is the company that supports that product? It may not be a lot of companies. And the reason why I say that is, if you're dealing with a medium-sized company and you do not have a network or a security engineer on staff, you may look to a consultant to take care of that. Well, you probably want to know if that consulting company supports or have expertise with the product or products that you have. So that's why it typically is safe to go towards bigger vendors like Cisco and Juniper and Palo Alto Networks and SonicWall, things like that, because you know that there's a lot of professional services out there. I also like to ask questions about how much can I customize within this product? Like, is there a ability of doing scripting within this product itself? Or is everything kind of closed out and I can't basically use like APIs, for example, with this product? So I like to ask little questions like that. What kind of customization can I actually do? And the other thing that is pretty important is understanding the features or the services like QoS and multicast and routing or data center overlays, whatever it is. What kind of features are supported on this device? And again, a lot of this will be presented within the data sheets of providing what is supported and what can be configured. And hopefully, maybe some of those features needs to be licensed before you can implement them. Another question that I like to ask is getting product comparisons. And partners usually have that information, like Cisco partners or Juniper partners. But basically, if I'm looking at, let's say, a Cisco ASA firewall, well, I like to compare it with what are other firewalls in the market that are basically aligned or equal to this firewall. I like to look at that information, look at, the throughput numbers, the feature set, the licensing, just things like that, kind of compare it between different similar models for part of my decision making. And another thing that I ask or determine about getting the right hardware for a client or a company is understanding the intended business size of that product. So if I get a particular firewall or a router, well, is it typically aimed for SMB, for medium, or for large size networks? And that will basically really determine based on the performance and the connection counts, things like that. The more connection counts, the higher throughput, the more enriched feature sets is typically for medium, larger type networks. But a lot of their documentation, like for Cisco or for Juniper or for FortiGate, for example, they will actually list that this is typically aimed for this size network. And that's what I typically start with. Because when I'm going through a network design and I'm trying to determine the right hardware for a client based on their requirements, then I will determine their business size, that they're small or a medium-sized network. So when I'm choosing the firewall or the router or the switch, I typically kind of look at the starting point of the hardware that is aimed for their business size, and then I can work up or work down based on other requirements like features and things like that. So those are some of the questions that I typically ask, especially in companies or for clients when looking at new hardware and new software that is new to me. Like there's a new vendor or something new coming out from Cisco. I like to basically use this checklist and gather some of this information. Now, it doesn't have to be all of it, and you can treat this as a baseline or kind of like a guideline, a guideline to kind of know what kind of things you should be looking at or asking or trying to determine about a particular hardware before you give your recommendation for the company or your client to buy that. And we're done with this episode. So thank you very much for the great questions. And always, I want to hear from the rest of you guys. So if you have any questions about being a network engineer or anything in the networking field, post your questions below in the comments and your question will come up in a future episode. So thank you very much for watching this video. Please subscribe to our channel. That means a lot. And also check us out and support our training program at routehub.net, where we have a lot of practical video training, a lot of cool stuff. And until next time, keep networking.